Welcome to lecture 5, segment 1. This lecture is about organization of the central nervous system and more specifically a part of the central nervous system called the cortex. So, before we get into the details of the central nervous system and its parts and so on and so forth, let us start with a small story. So, this story about a book, a very delightful book called Vehicles, written by Valentino Breitenberg, who is a neuroanatomist. And although the title says vehicles, it is not about vehicles like cars and trucks, it is about brains. Basically this book visualizes human bodies as vehicles with the brains as drivers of these vehicles. So, in fact Breitenberg creates these simple thought experiments, these thought toys, right, which look like simple vehicles and which respond to the external world and make interesting movements, and he compares the movements of these vehicles to those of real bodies driven by the nervous systems. So, in this book in chapter after chapter he defines these interesting vehicles and describes their properties. So, for example, let us start with a very simple vehicle. So, each of these vehicles actually has a bunch of sensors, and these sensors are connected to the wheels of the vehicle and drive them. So, in this case it is a very simple vehicle, it has only one sensor, it is a photoreceptor, it is a right, it responds to light, and the sensor is connected to there is only one wheel to the vehicle, and this sensor is directly connected to the wheel, and if the intensity of the light picked up by the sensor is strong, then the wheel is turned at a higher velocity, higher rate. So, this is actually a very simple vehicle, it does not do much that is interesting. So, if there is a light source in front of it, it will simply go towards light source, so show some kind of a phototaxis. Okay. So, nothing interesting happens here. So, let us take a slightly more complicated vehicle. Unlike the previous vehicle, this vehicle has two sides. So, there are two photoreceptors in the front, and then the two wheels on either right and one on either side. So, and then the photoreceptors are connected to the wheels through wires, and in the vehicle on the left side, vehicle number A, this photoreceptor on the right side is connected to the wheel on the right side, and vice versa for the other side. So, whereas on the vehicle on the right, and the photoreceptor on the right side is connected to the left vehicle and vice versa. So, let us take the left vehicle. So, you see that this photoreceptor on the right side, and then the light source is also on towards the right. So, the sensor on the right side will pick up a stronger signal, right, therefore, it turns the corresponding wheel, which is the right wheel, at a higher rate, right, whereas on sensor on the left side picks up a weaker signal, therefore, it turns the wheel on the left at a lower rate. So, therefore, you see that the wheel here, right, moves at a higher velocity than the wheel here. So, therefore, you can easily see that the vehicle turns to the left. Okay. So, somebody looking at this vehicle, the response of the vehicle to the light might say that this vehicle is afraid of light, right, it is expressing the emotion of cowardice. Okay. So, then let us look at the right vehicle, the vehicle number A, right. In this case the sensor on the right side is connected to the left vehicle and vice versa. So, the left sensor picks up a stronger signal, therefore, the right wheel moves at a higher velocity than the left wheel. So, therefore, the vehicle turns towards the left, towards the light source. But the thing is, since the connection between the sensor and the sensor and the wheel is a positive connection, right, as the sensor picks up stronger and stronger signals, the wheel turns faster and faster. Therefore, as the vehicle approaches the light, right, the signal gets stronger and stronger and the wheels turn faster and faster, and the vehicle simply rams into the light source, right. And if you look at it as some kind of a living organism, right, moving towards light source, then you would say that it hates light, and it is trying to aggressively dash towards light and destroy that light source, right. You can give this kind of an emotional commentary on what the vehicles are doing, and this is what Valentino Breitenberg does in his book. Now, let us change the wiring pattern slightly in the same vehicles and look at the radical change in behavior. So, in this case the wiring pattern is actually very similar to the previous case, but only difference is the connections in this case are negative connections. Okay. So, as a sensor picks up stronger and stronger signals, it turns the corresponding wheel slower and slower. Okay. So, the response is slightly different, interestingly different compared to the previous case. So, in this case when the wiring patterns are on the same side, that is the sensor connects to the wheels on the same side, then the vehicle actually goes towards the light source, right, unlike in the previous case where when the wires are on the same side, connect to the wheels on the same side, the vehicle turns away from this light source in the previous case. now the vehicle turns towards light source. But unlike before, since the connection strengths are negative, as the vehicle approaches the light source and gets closer and closer, the intensity of the light picked up by the sensors gets stronger and stronger, and correspondingly the wheels turn slower and slower. So, the vehicle actually slows down as it approaches the light source, right. Whereas the other vehicle, right, the connection strengths are still negative, but the wires connect to the wheels on the opposite side. So, in this case, unlike the vehicle on the previous slide, it actually turns away from the light source. But since the connection strengths here are negative, as the vehicle approaches the light source, it gets slower, and it is actually slows down as it approaches the vehicle and turns away. So, Bradenburg gives a very interesting amusing description or commentary on this kind of behavior. He says that the vehicle on the left, that is the vehicle A, displays a kind of a quiet adoration of the light source, because wherever it is, it moves towards light source and gently approaches light source and stops there when it comes very close to light source and just sits there close to light source as though it is adoring that light source. Whereas in the second case, in vehicle B, right, the vehicle charges ahead when it is far away, and as it comes very close to the light source, it gets cold feet, or it gets scared and gently veers away. And he says it kind of expresses a fickle and fanciful love. It is scared of commitment, therefore, once it gets too close to light source, it kind of veers away from the light source. So, you can make these kinds of commentaries on very simple models of vehicles, models which are a metaphor for the brains and the bodies. So, what the important take home lesson from Bradenburg's book is that brain is an input output system. Basically, it has all these sensors, the sense organs, right, which receive inputs from the external world, and this sensory information flows through certain pathways, the nerves and the pathways of the brain, and activate the outputs, which is the motor system. So, in this case, in the case of the vehicle, it is the wheels. The internal wiring patterns determine the function, determines how the vehicle responds to the world outside. But what is very interesting about these vehicles is even these kinds of extremely simple wiring patterns, it is actually quite trivial, just two wires going from a sensor to the wheels, right, can give very rich and interesting and even amusing behavior to the vehicles. So, what Bradenburg concludes is that you do not need a very complex brain in an organism to produce a very complex behavior. Even very simple internal organization of the nervous system, right, can produce very complex behaviors simply by virtue of the interaction of the organism with a very complex world. It is a world that is complex, but even the brain is simple, the organism can produce complex behaviors. Okay, with that background, now let us now look at the body and the nervous system. Right, the nervous system also, so actually it has two parts. We have talked about this once before. So, there is a part of the nervous system which is housed within the bony vault, the cranial vault and the vertebral column, right, that is called the central nervous system, and then there is these external wires which go out from the central nervous system and permeate the entire body, they innervate the entire body, and that is called the peripheral nervous system. So, within the central nervous system there is a cerebrum which consists of these two large hemispheres on either side, and there is cerebellum which is this organ in the back, right, of the brain. And then there is a spinal cord, okay, which extends from here to all the way to here, okay, and between spinal cord and the cerebrum there is brainstem, which can be more clearly seen in this picture. So, so from here to here it is okay, so the brainstem, okay, so which consists of again three regions, the midbrain which is here, and the pons, which is this whole structure, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, so generally if you are looking at if you are taking a typical medical course on nervous system, like a course on neurophysiology, right, very quickly you would see pictures like this. There are maps which tell you which part of the brain does what, and once you are introduced to basic anatomy of the brain, you are taught which parts of the brain do what kind of a function. For example, in this picture you can see that in the parietal lobe it controls, the parietal lobe is here. There are seats of intelligence and reasoning and language and sensation and so on, and in the frontal lobe again you can see that is right here, right, you can see again there are seats of intelligence and reasoning and behavior, but then you would wonder what is the difference between the reasoning as it is conducted by parietal lobe and as it is conducted by frontal lobe, and it is pretty confusing. So, these kinds of approaches are where you are given a bucket list of brain areas, and their corresponding functions, right. Probably they are good for writing exams and where you mug up a bunch of terms and regurgitate them in exams, but I feel they do not really give much insight into how brain function is organized in the brain. Okay, so for that, so this problem is very similar to understanding poetry or trying to read poetry in this strange format. So, I am going to tell you, read a poem to you, but in a very weird format, and you need to figure out what this poem is. So, the poem has 4 lines, and the third word of the first line is a, and the fourth word of the second line is in, the sixth word of the third line is of, and the fourth word of the fourth line is an, and so on and so forth. I am going to give you right the positions of various words by describing them over many sentences. I mean, it's a nightmare to figure out what this whole poem is by reconstructing all these all these instructions. Whereas, right, if I give the poem like this, to see a word in a grain of sand, and it's a famous poem from William Blake. Okay, so it's much easier, much more comfortable if you have the words are presented in a sequence and not like a bucket list, right, even if you give their coordinates. So, but this is the kind of pattern that people follow when they describe brain functions as maps like this. So, whereas what we will do, we will present the brain areas in a sequence, and then their function becomes more logical, more obvious, which is what we have begun to do in the last lecture, where we looked at multi-layer networks, where the networks connect to each other in a feed forward in a unidirectional fashion, where in the input layer you give the sensory input, right, in the output layer you pick up the motor output. We looked at examples of past tense learning, and we looked at net talk, or how network learns to convert text into speech and all that. So, there is input layer and then there is output layer. Between the two there is one hidden layer, right. This is a standard format of a 3-layered multi-layer perceptron, but brain is obviously more complicated. So, we can add more layers. So, we can have lots of layers between the input layer and output layer, the sensory layer and the motor layer, or you can even make it even more complex by having multiple sensory regions and multiple motor regions. So, for example, you can have an input layer which only receives sounds, another input layer which receives vision, or another which receives touch information from your skin, and the outputs can also be multiple output regions. So, you can have one region which controls your eye movements. So, here eyes does not mean like vision you are seeing, but eyes here refers to your motor output where you move your eyes around, okay. And then hands is controlling hands, and then you have legs, which area controls legs, and speech area which controls your vocal apparatuses. So, you can now superimpose this kind of a high level picture on a picture of the nervous system, and see how you can apply this picture onto nervous system. So, suppose I am looking at an object and there is a cup on the table and I want to reach out to the cup. So, information comes through the eyes and goes to the visual areas, and then goes to the motor areas, then comes down to the spinal cord, right, goes to the nerves of the hand and reaches the hand, activates the hand, and hand moves and grabs the cup. Or you are getting a strange smell from some point in some place in the room, and that smell goes to the nostrils, goes to the olfactory bulb, right, and then it goes to the motor cortex and goes on to the spinal cord and activates the nerves of your legs, and you walk towards, right, the source of the smell, and maybe you discover a dead rat. So, you see in both these examples you have an input source of sensory information which goes through multiple stages within the nervous system, both peripheral and central, and then output activates some kind of a motor apparatus, and you produce some kind of a movement. So, this pathway from sensory to motor actually is organized at multiple levels. There are multiple levels of control, like the levels of management in a large company. You can have upper management, lower middle management, and the lower team team leaders, and so on and so forth, and then you have vice presidents at the top. There is a similar hierarchy in the way brain controls its output. So, there is a lowest level which is called the spinal cord level. So, for example, you have information coming from outside which goes to the spinal cord, then there is this immediate pathway which goes back to the same site of origin of this sensory information. That is called the spinal cord level. A good example of this is your reflexes. For example, when you go to a doctor, very often right, when you go to a neurologist, sometimes neurologist tests your knee reflex by tapping on your knee with a rubber hammer. When you do that, you just kind of gently jerk your knee. So, in this case the sensory information is going from your knee to the spinal cord, and the return signal comes back to the same knee joint and activates the muscles. So you produce this flick of the joint. Then there is a next higher level where sensory information goes all the way to the subcortical area. There are lots of I will define what is cortex and subcortex very soon, but let us just say for now that cortex is surface of the brain and subcortex is structures which are located deep inside the brain. So you go all the way to the subcortex and come back and produce movement. Okay, that is subcortical level, and the cortical level consists of a much longer pathway where you receive input from outside and goes all the way to the brain surface and comes down and goes out producing movement. So these are the three broad levels of control in the brain. If you think of the brain function as simply a long pathway from the sensory to the motor areas. Okay, so that shows the cortical level, subcortical level and the spinal cord level. So let us begin with cortex. Like I said just a moment ago, cortex is this the surface of the brain which consists of sheets of neurons. So it is like imagine covering the entire brain with a sheet of cells, right, and you can see, and this sheet is about 2 to 5 millimeters in thickness. It consists of 6 layers of neurons. So in this picture you can see the sheet, right, covering the the brain, and actually in this picture you can, this is a coronal section of the brain. You can see that brownish outline of this section, and this outline is the cortex. And if in the picture below you can see a further blow up of a small part of this outline, this cortex. You can see that there are 6 layers numbered from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We will talk about the connectivities of these layers and so on later on in the course. So then there are subcortical structures. So the surface of the brain and this sheet of neurons is called the cortex, and deep inside the brain there are lots of again neural masses. These are the subcortical structures. So for example, there is the caudate nucleus, or putamen and amygdala and hippocampus, and all these structures are subcortical structures. So let us begin with the cortex. For that let us quickly recall that there are these lobes of the brain, because lobes are superficial and so cortex is also superficial. So there is occipital lobe, and then there is a parietal and temporal and frontal lobe. Okay, within the brain surface in the cortex there are many different cortical areas. I am not going to now again go into these cortical areas, because that is again like going back to our bucket list of functions kind of approach, and we said that is not very helpful. So let us now go through certain important sensory cortical areas. So if you look at touch, right, how touch is processed, right, you touch something with your hand and there are these touch receptors in the tips of your fingers, which convert the pressure information or other properties like temperature, tickle, itch and all this other touch related information, right, into electrical signals, and this information climbs up along this pathway. You see this blue line which goes to the spinal cord first and then climbs up, right. There is a first stop over here, and it climbs further up, goes to the thalamus. Now thalamus is a very important sensory hub, right. It is like most sensory information going into the brain first goes through this big junction box, right, called thalamus, and from there it goes upwards to the cortex, to the appropriate cortical area which specializes in processing that form of sensory input. So in case of touch input, or what is called somatosensory input, right, the corresponding cortical area is called the somatosensory cortex. So this is located right here, and so this purple region, and in fact you see this dark groove that is called the central sulcus, and before that you have the precentral gyrus, which is this pink area, and then behind that you have the postcentral gyrus, which is the purple area, and the somatosensory cortex is located inside the postcentral gyrus. So we have just used the terms gyrus and sulcus. Okay, so you can see that brain surface is made up of these convolutions, these folding patterns, which can be compared to hills and valleys, and gyri are like hills and sulci are like valleys or grooves. In fact, there is a very simple mnemonic for memorizing this. So the Sanskrit word for mountain is giri. So gyri are like giri or mountains, and sulci are grooves. So on the right side, look at a side view or a section of the somatosensory cortex, and you can see that different body parts are mapped onto different areas in the somatosensory cortex. So for example, you can see the lip region here. That means if you say touch the lower lip, it will activate the corresponding neurons in that part of the somatosensory cortex, or if you maybe touch your toes, right, it will activate the foot area in the somatosensory cortex and so on and so forth. But you can see that the brain surface is really distorted, right, in its map on the somatosensory cortex. We will talk about this later on in more detail in this course. Then if you look at visual system, the visual information goes into the eyes and then it is sent to the thalamus and then further to the cortex. Let us see how that works out. So, information from your right visual field, which is shown here, that is all that you see on the right of your of your fixation point, and all that you see on the left side, that is your left visual field. Both of them go to both the eyes, right. You can see that right visual field is seen in this part of the eye and also in this part of the eye on the right eye, and similarly left visual field is seen in this part of the left eye and this part of the right eye. Now, both these informations are broadcast, are sent upwards to thalami, right. There are, so in thalamus there is a part of thalamus called lateral geniculate nucleus where this information goes. This is like a first stopover, and from there it is sent further up, right, to the cortex, to the primary visual cortex, which is inside the occipital lobe. So, from the primary visual cortex, which is called the V1, right, now you see the side view of the same picture. From V1 it goes to V2 and then to MT and so on. This is called the dorsal pathway or the wear pathway. We talked about this a little bit before, and also it goes to V2 and V4 and lower down into the temporal lobe, into inferior temporal lobe, right. So, which is called the Watt pathway, because once you come to the inferior temporal lobe, there are neurons which respond to complex objects. So, it basically that part of the brain tells you what the object is, and therefore, it is called the Watt pathway. And whereas in the other pathway, the dorsal pathway, it tells you where the object is, therefore, it is called the where pathway. Then if you look at audition or the auditory pathway, you process sounds and then you convert them into electrical signals. So, the sound vibrations of the air which enter the ear, external ear, act on the tympanum and then produce vibrations in the tympanum. And we know some of this stuff from our high school biology, right. So, these vibrations are converted into electrical signals inside the cochlea, and cochlea actually analyzes the frequencies that consist inside the sound signals that we listen to and convert these frequencies into electrical signals. So, it does some kind of a Fourier transform. If you have done any engineering courses on Fourier transform, you can relate to what the cochlea does. So, it breaks up the frequencies present in the input signal and performs some kind of Fourier transform of this signal, and these signals are sent from the cochlea to the next stopover, which is the cochlear nucleus and then the superior olivary nucleus. From there it goes up to inferior colliculus, and from there it goes to a part of the thalamus again called the medial geniculate nucleus. And like I mentioned once before, thalamus is like this big junction box through which most sensory input going into the brain has to pass through. It is in fact called the gateway to the cortex. So, beyond the thalamus it goes to the appropriate part of the cortex, which is called the auditory cortex or the primary auditory cortex, and in a side view you can see that somewhere here, okay, in the superior temporal lobe. Then let us look at olfactory system, that is how do you process smells. Now, for smell is based on your inhalation, right. You inhale when you inhale the smell molecules, the chemical that produces smell, right, are taken into the nostrils, and here these molecules interact with the olfactory receptors which are there inside the nostrils, and from there this information which is converted into electrical signals are transmitted by an olfactory nerve to a structure called olfactory bulb, which can be seen here, and from there it is sent to various cortical regions called the piriform cortex, entorhinal cortex. These are all in the base of the brain underneath the in the lower part of the temporal lobe, and then also to amygdala. Okay, so so far we have seen how different sensory types of information enters the brain and how, and reach different cortical areas. But beyond a point, these sensory informations begin to blend, because when you are looking at sensory information, very often you do not treat it in its pure form. You combine vision with sound, and you combine vision with touch, and so on and so forth. So, suppose you are reading some text aloud, you look at the sound of it, you look at the the visual appearance of the text, and so on and so forth. So, you tend to combine different sensory modalities, and this combination occurs in the next stage, which is in the parietal lobe. So, let us look at that. So, parietal lobe is this whole region is called the parietal lobe. So, within this there is the lateral side, so side of the brain, and then the medial side, which is in the center in the mid, you can see it in the mid sagittal section. We are not talking about the medial side, medial side for the moment. So, within the lateral side, so the lateral posterior parietal, because in the front in the anterior parietal you have the somatosensory areas, but if you go back a little, right, you have the posterior parietal cortex. Within this there are two regions, one above and one below. The one above is called the superior parietal lobule and the one below is called the inferior parietal lobule. And the superior parietal lobule, which is here, right, you can see that it is very conveniently located between the touch processing areas here and the vision processing areas, which are all over here. So, it is located exactly in the middle of these two regions. So, it is only natural that the neurons in the superior parietal lobe, right, they integrate the sense of touch and vision, and they respond to both touch information and the visual information. So, which is necessary if I want to operate a pen like this, I am looking at it and I am touching it, I am feeling it. So, I need to combine both these informations that to be able to manipulate the pen effectively. So, similarly, if you go to posterior parietal cortex, if you go back a little, right, you have what is called the sensory association areas, which combine both all the three modes of sensory information, that is touch, visual and auditory. So, that is back way back a little bit in parietal area. So, you can see that this area is located, if I let me clean up this a little bit. So, this area is located very strategically between among three areas. You have auditory system here, you have visual system here, you have touch somatosensory system here. This area is located right in the middle, right, at some kind of a triple point between these three sensory areas. So, you can see that it is capable of combining information from touch, visual and auditory kinds of sensory information. So, this is the area which also tells where the target is. Then there is Wernicke's area, which is also located in the posterior parietal or left, and this is typically located in the left posterior parietal. We have seen in our very first lecture or maybe the second lecture that Wernicke's area is responsible for language understanding, for comprehension of language, and this is located in the left hemisphere in most people who are right handed. So, 95% of right handed individuals have the this Wernicke's area located in the left brain, and in about 60% of the left handed individuals it is also located in the left brain. Okay, so, until now the basic sensory processing occurs in both sides of the brain, in both hemispheres, but language processing seems to become unilateral. It is only on one side, it occurs either mostly in the left side of the brain. On the right posterior parietal, then there is a kind of a complementary area which is responsible for large scale spatial analysis. So, damage to this area can give rise to problems related to understanding space. So, for example, right, if there is a lesion in the right posterior parietal cortex, so since the right brain processes the left part of the world and the left brain processes the right part of the world, so damage to the right posterior parietal cortex gives rise to difficulties in handling the left part of the world. So, in fact, the difficulty in this case is so profound that the patients simply fail to recognize or acknowledge the left part of the world. So, here is a picture of a clock drawn by a patient who suffers from a lesion or a damage to the right posterior parietal cortex, and in this case the person has drawn the clock only on the right side. The person has completely omitted the details of the clock on the left side, because it is as though the left side of the space or left side of the world does not exist, right, for this patient. Similarly, a patient suffering from this left hemi-neglect, which is what this condition is called, it was asked to search or visually scan a certain image which has these little features consisting of right angles and T junctions. So, normal person would scan the entire image, but the hemi-neglect person seems to be scanning only the right half of the image, right. These dots show and the lines here show the scan path. So, the lines show the path that is traversed by your eyes as you scan the image, and the dots show where the eyes are fixated temporarily. So, in this case also the patients have failed to acknowledge or look at the left part of the image. There is another interesting experiment done by hemi-neglect patients. So, people were taken to a famous cathedral in the city of Milan in Italy, This cathedral is called Piazza del Duomo. So, in one case the patients were asked to face the cathedral and describe the cathedral. In the other case the patients were asked to turn their back on the cathedral and describe the street that is in front of the cathedral. In both cases the patients only described the left part of the scene, as though momentarily the right part of the scene disappeared or simply became non-existent, right. So, for the patients. Then let us go to temporal lobe. Temporal lobe again has 3 different regions. There is a superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus. So, superior temporal gyrus, and we have already mentioned that it has area which process sounds, it is called primary auditory cortex. Then middle temporal gyrus has areas which process semantic memory or memory of words or naming or names of objects, right, the verbal names of objects. So, it is also involved in language processing. And the inferior temporal gyrus, which is a part of the Watt pathway as you mentioned before, right, deals with representing whole objects, right, and it is also related to names of objects. So, that is where you store names of objects. So, we talked about sensory input, we talked about combining sensory input. Then let us go to the motor side and look at different forms of motor output. So, there is motor output there is mapped, is represented in the frontal part of the brain, in the frontal lobe. So, in fact, a very broad thumb rule for organization of function in the brain is the posterior brain or the brain behind the central sulcus, right, is mostly about sensory processing, about processing inputs, whereas the anterior brain or the brain in the front of the central sulcus is mostly about action, output or planning, or before you perform some action you plan to for it, and you have a strategy for it, and all the strategizing and decision making and actions, all that occurs in the anterior brain before the central sulcus. Okay, so, there are lots of areas which control movement or the so called motor areas in the frontal lobe. So, for example, there is a primary motor cortex, right, where if you activate neurons. So, the blue region here is the primary motor cortex, which is right in front of the central sulcus in the precentral gyrus. So, here if you activate neurons, they produce activation of some specific muscle or a part of a muscle. Whereas, if you activate the supplementary motor cortex, which is at a higher level in the hierarchy than the primary motor cortex, you will produce a whole complex sequence of movements, like for example, say waving the hand, right. And what is interesting is supplementary motor cortex gets activated even when you are not moving, but you are only imagining movement, right. So, suppose you are imagining that you are playing on a piano and you can see the supplementary motor cortex is active, but when you are actually playing the piano, that is when the primary motor cortex also joins the activity. Then there is a premotor cortex which is located here, right, and this cortex is also above the primary motor cortex, and here also if you activate neurons, they produce sequence of movements. But what is interesting about premotor is that neurons here also respond to visual inputs. So, this part is responsible for visually guided movements. Now, suppose you need to catch a ball and the ball is coming towards you and you have to move your hand into the path of the ball and meet the ball and catch the ball. To do that, it is not enough to just activate your hand, you should also process the visual information as it is coming in and coordinate the movement of the hand with respect to the visual information. So, you need to have the corresponding area which controls your hand also respond to visual information. So, that is exactly what happens in the premotor cortex. Then there are frontal eye fields, because so your motor output, right, your voluntary motor output consists of either moving your hands or moving your trunk and moving your legs, right. All these consist of movements of skeletal muscle. Okay, in addition to this, your output consists of moving your eyes, okay, or moving your vocal cords, activating your vocal cords so as to produce speech. So, movement of eyes is controlled by what are called frontal eye fields, and they are located somewhere here. Okay, so, you can see that all these motor areas are all together, they are nearby, close to each other. Then Broca's area we have seen before, right, is somewhere here, and that controls speech. So, we have talked about the sensory areas, we have talked about the motor areas, but what happens in between the two, right, in this huge part of the brain which connects the sensory areas to the motor areas. Okay, so far we have been describing as if the sensory input simply goes on, right, crossing all these stages and getting translated into motor action. It is as though there is no control, it is as though you are a kind of a helpless a victim of your sensory inputs. That is, if you see some sensory input, you have to produce, right, helplessly and without any inhibition the corresponding motor action. So, to give some examples, suppose you look at a brush, a toothbrush, right, a logical function which you do with this toothbrush is brushing. So, immediately pick it up and brush yourself. Or if you look at a hammer, a logical function which you perform with a hammer is hammering a nail, right. So, you pick up the hammer and keep performing, right. I mean, so obviously that is not how we live, and we do not respond to every object and immediately act on those objects as if we do not have any choice, right, of refraining from acting on that object. So, obviously we have a choice, we decide whether to perform the act or not to perform the act, right, because if you keep on acting or responding to the world like this, in fact that is actually there is a psychological condition called the environment dependency syndrome, where the person has no volition or will of his or her own, is completely dependent on the environmental conditions. So, suppose you see a comb lying on the table, right, you immediately pick it up and comb your hair, right, or you see a pen, then you immediately pick it up and start writing something, right. So, obviously I mean you cannot live like that, because you have your own objectives, you have your own choices that you want to make, and then the way you respond to a given input, a given sensory input, depends upon what you have in the mind, right. So, it is that is provided by the frontal lobe, a part of the frontal lobe which is called the prefrontal cortex. So, this is what comes in between your input and output. So, in fact we can just make a simple cartoon picture here. So, this is your sensory input and this is your motor output, and between these two you want to have a gate, right, which decides whether or not to go with this action. Okay, that gate is located somewhere in this prefrontal cortex. In fact, there is not a single gate, there is a whole system of gates which are located inside the prefrontal cortex. So, so this is inside the frontal lobe, right, as you can see in this picture. So, this is so this part is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, and what you have seen before, where the motor areas are located, they are in frontal lobe, but not in the prefrontal cortex. So, here again there are a couple of interesting important areas in the prefrontal cortex. There is the orbitofrontal cortex, which when disinhibited, right, produces impulsive behavior and poor, their emotions are constantly shifting and fluctuating, they have poor judgment about what is right and what is wrong, right, they are quickly distracted in their plans and keep changing their plans, and so on and so forth. Then there is a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in working memory, and that refers to how you store information for a short period of time. For example, if you are dialing a phone number, you look at the number written on a piece of paper and keep it in your mind for a moment, and then you dial it in. So, this is the kind of memory that is called working memory, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is part of the prefrontal cortex, is involved in this kind of working memory. So, therefore, when it is lesion or damage, people show apathy, lack of will, and there is a condition called abulia, which denotes lack of will. So, person suffering from abulia could be simply sitting there all day long, without initiating any action, and he has to be, or she has to be told what to do, and on her own, or the person may not have any will or motivation to perform actions. So, then there is a loss of self, because the sense of personality, sense of self is represented in this area, and so damage here, right, gives rise to loss of self and stimulus bound behavior. But a lot of our understanding of prefrontal cortex, maybe in the very first example of our understanding of prefrontal cortex, has come with an accident to this person called Phineas Gage. I think we talked about this story in an earlier lecture. So, Gage was a railroad construction worker who worked in America in the late 19th century. His job was to pack ammunition, right, and then explode bombs and soften the soil so that you can lay down the railroads. As he was doing that once, the bombs kind of blew up on his face, and the crowbar with which he was packing the ammunition went through his prefrontal cortex, damaging his orbitofrontal cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So, after that he survived, but there was very profound personality changes, right, in this subject, and the doctor who treated him, this is how we would describe Gage's personality. He says Gage was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity. He would swear, which was not his nature earlier, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. So, basically he shows very highly variable and fluctuating emotional condition, and is very impatient, there is no restraint, and these are the kinds of capabilities that are given by orbitofrontal cortex, and he cannot remember things, he cannot hang on to a goal, and to be able to pursue a goal and hang on to a goal and show committed action towards and work towards a goal, you need to have strong memory. So, for example, take the simple example of how you go to a kitchen to drink some water, right. You go to the kitchen, open your refrigerator, and very often when you go to the kitchen you forget, or open the refrigerator you forget what you have come there for. Then you kind of you scratch your head, and then you recall that you have come there to drink some water, and you pick up the bottle and drink. So, to be able to pursue goal directed behavior, you need to be able to keep the memory of the goal for a extended period of time, and that is where prefrontal comes into picture, and therefore prefrontal damage destroys that capability, and so the person cannot hang on to a goal and pursue the goal for a long period. So, which is what you see in case of Phineas Gage, right. He would devise many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. Okay, this is a typical prefrontal condition. So, prefrontal lobe is important for planning and working memory, like we just said. Goal oriented behavior involves planning and working memory and requires these prefrontal areas. Then we also talked about dorsolateral prefrontal area, which is involved in working memory and decision making. So, injury to prefrontal cortex can give rise to cognitive deficits like we have seen just now, and it also affects the verbal fluency and shows poor performance in a working memory task called delayed response task. Let us see what this task is. So, here you can see a chimp facing two boxes, box A and box B, and one of the boxes hides a banana and the other box is empty. So, the chimp gets to look at the two boxes and what is underneath these boxes first, and then a screen comes between the chimp and the boxes, and the screen remains there for some time. So, in the meantime the chimp has to remember which box was hiding the banana. Then the screen is removed. The chimp had its DLPFC or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex intact, that it remembers exactly which box has a banana and opens the box and picks up the banana. But if the DLPFC is damaged, then it does not remember. So, it has to just by looking at the boxes in their covered form, it will not be able to know where the banana is and keeps wondering where the banana is. Then there is medial prefrontal cortex, which again has involvement in decision making. It is involved in retrieval of memories from much longer term memories. So, DLPFC is into working memory, which is a short term memory on the order of seconds and minutes, but then we also need to have much longer memories. Sometimes we pursue goals for years and decades through our lives, right. To do that you need to have parts of the brain which can handle or store information for much longer term, and medial prefrontal cortex is one such an important area in that circuit. Therefore, damage to medial prefrontal cortex can impair stress response and also show deficits in retrieving remote memories. Okay, so that completes a kind of a summary of some of the important cortical areas, and we have tried to put them together in a kind of a logical sequence, as if input comes to the sensory input and then flows through various intermediate regions of the brain, right, and flows upwards through distinct hierarchical pathways, right, and then after some point they blend, they merge, and then goes through various intermediate areas, the prefrontal cortex, the decision making areas of prefrontal cortex, and then they go to motor areas where they flow downwards, right, via distinct hierarchical pathways and produce various kinds of motor output. So, the sensory input stream, right, climbs upwards, motor output stream climbs downwards, and then between the two there are these decision making regions of the prefrontal cortex, which decide which motor action is appropriate for a given input, and it also decides whether or not to perform the motor action, whether to perform the action or not perform the action, whether to do it or not to do it. Thank you.